In this video, I want to show you how to replace your timing chain with guides and tensioner and everything that has to do with the timing on this 5.4 liter Triton V8 Ford engine. To disconnect the battery, use an 8mm wrench and remove the negative terminal. Someone left some extra pieces here, but I'm going to fix that in a little bit, and as well as the corrosion. But either way, take the terminal off, set it aside to where it can't make connection with the negative battery terminal. Now, you don't have to remove the wheel. I did only for camera purposes, but if you come through the passenger side wheel well, you can see the radiator petcock right here. Take a 19mm socket. I built myself out of some aluminum foil a little shield right here so that the coolant, instead of it shooting straight out on the frame, it can follow down and fall into my collection bucket. Take a 19mm socket, put it on the drain plug and unscrew it. It should not be too tight. If it is, try to work it gently. You don't want it to break. And unscrew it until coolant starts coming out. Don't take this out though, because if you do, it'll start shooting backwards. And now we'll just let this drain. In order to speed up the process, let's go remove the radiator cap. There actually is no radiator cap. It's just an overflow cap. This is what holds pressure on the system. So we'll just unthread this. Air will go in as coolant tries to go out. I need to get this cover out of the way, and in order to do that, I have to get the spare tire tool / jack handle out of the way. So just unclip it from its retainers and set it aside. And now we can just go along and undo all the push clips that hold this down. I don't have any of my original push clips anymore. These are all aftermarket push clips that someone has put in. So whatever yours are, just go ahead and remove them in whatever way they need to be removed. With all the push clips removed, don't forget there are 2 over here. Lift this up and slide it out of the way. Let's get this air intake out of here. Lift up on this. Underneath, you'll see the wire. Follow it and unplug the mass airflow sensor. There we go. And I'm trying to remove this whole unit, so I'm just going to unbolt the clamp on the throttle body and take this out as one whole assembly. There is another connector over here. Unplug that. And to actually get to the throttle body, I need to remove this cover, 3 8mm bolts. Remove these 2 hoses, and then unscrew this clamp with an 8mm socket. Now you can wiggle this whole assembly, pull it right off the throttle body, pick it up and set it aside. With a pair of pliers, remove this upper radiator hose clamp, and then you can break the hose free off the radiator. Sometimes it needs to be persuaded a little bit, so very gently with the pliers, break it free. Now you can slide it off. Since the coolant has mostly drained, there shouldn't be any in this hose, which there isn't. That's perfect. On the driver's side, there is the overflow hose. Remove the clamp, break the hose free very gently, and remove the hose. Now I will be removing this overflow tank only for visual purposes. You don't have to remove it, but otherwise there's no way I can get the camera in here to show you how to remove these lines, the transmission lines. So I like to get a better angle for you. Again, you do not have to remove this. Okay, here we go. Now you can see a lot better. This is what's holding the line on here, this plastic clip. So remove it. Just pry on the 2 little tabs. At this point, you want to spray some rust penetrant here to lubricate the line, but also clear out any debris. And then you need one of these tools that is specifically made for these lines here. Find the right size, slide it over, and press it in. Make sure you have a collection bucket underneath to catch any fluid that might come out. Okay, yep. Once it goes in all the way and it bottoms out, go ahead and pull on the line. There we go. Take the line out, get your tool off, and then we'll do the same thing to the lower line, which is straight down. And with the line out of the way, you can remove this 8mm bolt that holds on the fan shroud. There's one on this side and then one on the other side, so do both. Next, you need a fan clutch removal tool, which looks like this. It's basically a giant wrench that goes on the end of your air hammer, and you use this to break free the fan clutch from the pulley here. And you want to do this before the belt is off. That way it can be held in place as much as possible. So situate your tool, and you want to spin it counterclockwise. This is a regular thread, it's not reverse thread. That's it, it broke free. Sometimes it takes a lot more than this, but at this point, You can spin it and it should come off of the pulley. Make sure you don't drop it though, so be careful as you do this. Okay, there we go. Now you can pull the shroud and the fan up at the same time. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and close my petcock so that it can stop dripping. Nice and snug, but not too tight. It's just plastic. Next, I want to remove the 4 10mm bolts that hold on the water pump pulley to the water pump. Do this while the belt is still on. That way it can be held tightly, otherwise it's just going to want to spin on you. I am using an air ratchet, which will work to my advantage because although it's not an air impact, it will have some force to break these free. If you don't have one of these and you have to do it by hand, I suggest trying to hold this with your hand or put a little bit of extra tension on the belt tensioner to tighten this up. Whatever works for you, but you have to get these 4 broken free. Don't remove them all the way because the pulley will just fly off at this point with the tension of the belt, but loosen them up. Okay, that doesn't work. Luckily for me, I have this tool right here, which is a 3/8 impact. Again, if you don't have it, try to do something else, but what you saw is what most likely is going to happen. These are all broken free. Let's get the belt off. This right here is the tensioner. As you can see, it has a 1/2-inch drive in the head of it, right where the pulley sits. So I'm going to put my 1/2-inch ratchet in there with a small extension. I'm using a long breaker bar because this tensioner is pretty stiff. Go ahead and remove the belt off of anything. Whatever you can reach, let go of the tensioner and remove your tool. And now we can remove the belt. Take a note of how it's routed. I'm going to show you in the video once it's time to reinstall it, but it's always a good idea to take a picture if you don't have the diagram. With a 13mm socket, remove the idler pulley. With a 10mm socket and a small extension, I'm going to remove the bolts that hold on this tensioner. Remove the tensioner. Finish removing the water pump pulley. Sometimes these are stuck on here, so grab a little rubber mallet and bonk it. That should break it free. There it is. I have a collection bucket underneath, and now I'm going to take out all the bolts that hold on the water pump. I'm going to start at the top and end at the bottom. I'm going to leave this one in, just a few threads so it holds the water pump on. Okay, finally. Take that last bolt out, and this is why we were fighting it. The water pump was corroded in there, and you know, the surface doesn't look too pretty, but it's not the worst, so we'll clean that up. Now let's get the power steering pump pulley off. I have the special tool that allows me to do this. Slide it on to the power steering pulley here and tighten up the center shaft. And for me, this is a 25mm wrench that fits on the base of the tool here. That's going to hold it in place, and a 13mm, which will thread this rod in and therefore pull the pulley off. There it is. Now let's just get the tool off. And here's your pulley. Now it's time to remove the harmonic balancer, 18mm socket. Take out the bolt. And now we need a harmonic balancer removal tool. It looks like this. It's a puller And you need 3 M8 by 125 bolts, which will thread into the harmonic balancer and will pull it out as you thread in this main bolt. So let's thread these in. That'll hold my puller. I'm just going to get them started for now, but then of course we're going to make sure that this is all evenly spaced. Okay, I switched to some smaller bolts because I realized the other ones were way too long. And now we have to center up that puller. I'm going to make sure that all these bolts are equally tight. It's important to center up the puller. Now I'm going to use my 19mm socket, thread this in, and as I thread this in, the pulley should come right out. There it is. Perfect. Let's get the rest of this hose off of here. Take the clamp off. Break it free. And remove the hose. Next, let's disconnect the cables for the throttle body. Unhook this spring over here, and then this cable, if you slide it forward and push the cable back, it should pop out. And this one, open up the throttle body all the way and just unhook the cable by sliding it to the side. Just like this. And now I'm just going to unbolt this whole bracket off of the intake. 3 10mm bolts. Take this and just set it to the side. There's a hose back here that needs to come off. At the front here we have a heater core hose. Grab some pliers, take the clamp off. Break the hose free, and let's remove it off of the intake. Coolant's coming out, keep that in mind. Okay, I guess it was just a drip. Set this aside, a little hose over here. I'm gonna use a flathead screwdriver for this one. Loosen up the clamp, break the hose free, and remove the hose. Now this one will stay attached. I'm not gonna take it off the other end because it's actually hooked onto the throttle body right there. I like to get some of these wires and vacuum hoses out of the way. So I'm gonna peel this boot back, and with the battery disconnected, we can use a 10mm socket, unbolt the main power wire to the starter. Try not to lose this mounting nut. Take that off, I'm gonna put the nut back on so I can save it for later. And now, it looks like someone secured this with a giant wire tie, so let's cut this off. Okay, let's get that out of there. That held this broken connector in. Need a pocket screwdriver for this one. Pry the locking tab forward towards the front of the alternator and pull up. And now we just have to remove a few 10mm bolts. This one being one of them. And this one right here. This will take this whole bracket out underneath here. And now the alternator is free to come right out. Let's remove the power steering bracket off the intake. 10mm socket. Remove these electrical connectors over here. It leads to the back of the intake there. So I'm going to grab a little screwdriver and very, very gently pry this hose off of here. Okay. Follow this, goes over there, over here, this red one. Okay, now we can very carefully move this out of the way. The wires are very fragile, or the hoses, not the wires. We need to disconnect some of these vacuum hoses here. So I'm gonna pull this one off of here, leave the end connected to the throttle body. There's another one that goes back there. Looks like it has a little clamp, so let's grab some needle nose pliers, unhook this clamp, and remove the hose. Oh, okay, whole PCV valve comes out. That's fine, I guess. Okay, finally, this comes off. So now, this can stay right here. For now, throttle body can be removed with all of these hoses still attached to it. I'm gonna use an 8mm wrench and remove these bolts that hold the throttle body onto the intake. Okay, that can stay there. On this side I'm going to have to use a swivel. Okay, here it is. Take that out. Now we have to undo the EGR valve. So it looks like this whole assembly is connected with this bracket, and then this is connected to that, which is also connected to this, and it's like a whole concoction of things that need to come apart. So I'm going to start by unplugging the exhaust pressure sensor, or the EGR pressure sensor, and it can stay attached to the bracket. But we have to unbolt this bracket from the intake with a 10 millimeter right here. Now this can come off, and we can disconnect or unplug the two hoses that go to the EGR. And now we can unbolt the EGR from the throttle body. To do that, you can use a deep 10 millimeter socket. There you go. Of course, that one comes right out. This big one can come with the throttle body, but this one back here needs to slide off. There's a connection back there. Let's unhook that. There's your throttle body with all the attachments and hoses and everything. Now I need to unplug and remove all of the ignition coils and then unplug the fuel injectors. So I'm going to just unplug both at the same time. Just start on one side, work my way to the other. The fuel injectors can stay with the intake, but the ignition coils need to be removed. Use a pocket screwdriver for this connection here. Try to pry up the tab and disconnect it. I'm going to leave this over here. Now we can lift up this harness and just move it out of my way a little bit. Let's get a 7 millimeter and unbolt all the ignition coils. And let's do the same to the driver's side. Okay, so now to disconnect these fuel lines, you need these special adapters that you can slide over the line. I'm going to start with this one. Press the adapter in. Okay, pull the line towards the tool. Try to push it back. There we go. I know you couldn't see that, but there it is. All right, let's do the other one. This one is a larger size. Do the same thing. Press the tool in. Once the tool bottoms out, press the line or pull the line towards you. Okay. And just like that, you can, oh, yep, there we go. There's always fuel in the line, so, watch out for that. And take this out. And now in order to remove this intake manifold, I'm gonna take out the 9 bolts that hold it on. They're all 10 millimeter in size. So I'm gonna start from the outside and work my way in. Some of them are different, so remember how they go. This here, for example, holds the thermostat housing in place. Take this line out of here. Lift up the intake, see if there's anything else connected to it. Okay, there it is. Set this aside. Remove the old gaskets. Let's get rid of some wiring here. Well, not get rid, but just, move it to the side. So unplug this connector and this connector. Use a pocket screwdriver to pry the connector up, or the locking tab. That wire over there. Okay, perfect. This harness is free. It can sit right there. Down here at the manifold, you'll see two nuts. One is the top one, which is what we're going for. This one right here. This is the fitting on the pipe. This is just an adapter that threads into the manifold, so don't worry about this lower one. Here, yours also might be very rusty, in which case you might have to cut it off, remove this fitting, or even remove the manifold and replace it. Okay, that popped off. Let's go back up top and remove it from the top. So this is the power steering reservoir. Has this bracket that goes all the way down. This is what we want to unbolt. And now through the driver's side wheel well, I want to remove these two bolts over here, which I mentioned from above are the ones for the power steering reservoir. They're going to be pretty difficult to get to, and I'm going to start with the one that you see first. Okay, let's give this a shot. 18mm socket. Okay, I guess I'll try to break it free by hand. Okay, broke that one free. There is another one next to it. I'm going to try and break that one free as well while I'm at it. I know you can't see it, but I'll show you it in a second. Okay. And there's the other one right there, right between these brake lines. Also on the driver's side, you have this 8mm bolt that holds the oil dipstick tube in. So let's go ahead and remove this. Get this out. Oil dipstick tube is free. And with it unbolted, what we can actually do is take out the 10mm that hold the reservoir onto this bracket, so we can just get this bracket right out of our way. This one can actually stay in. Okay. Next, you have to get the valve covers off. I'm going to start with this driver's side here because you can see it better on camera. I'm still going to show you the passenger side, but it's going to be the same thing. And like I just said, you get a better view over here. Okay, 8mm bolts all around both of these valve covers. Let's go for it. All right, this valve cover should be free. Yep. Pull it up. Get the gasket up with it. There's one of them. All right, on this side it's going to get a little more interesting because the wiring harness is a lot stiffer. it won't move out of the way like this one, and we'll have to get the bottom bolts from underneath from the wheel well, because all of this is going to be in the way. So let's just do the top first for now. And from the passenger side wheel well, here's what you see. I'm going to start back here because I already have a short socket on my air ratchet, so before I change it out to a deep socket, I'm just going to work my way from the back to the front because I need the short socket in the back here. Oh, that one's already done. All right, valve cover's free. Oh yeah, let's go up top and take it out. All right, let's get the wire out of the way. The PCV hose is already disconnected. So lift up on the valve cover. Hopefully all the bolts are completely loosened up. Okay, I tried to move the wires around a little bit. Okay, okay. Hey, there we go. And now it's finally time to take the timing cover off. I'm going to start over here and just work my way around. This is actually just a nut that holds on this wire, and then with an 18 millimeter you can take that off. Okay, this one's actually a 15 millimeter. These ones around the water pump have this shanked part, and the thread is actually smaller, so keep that in mind. This one's also an 18. Same with this one over here. More 13s. This one's full of debris, so I'm going to try and get the junk off of here. This one here is actually a 22 millimeter. At this point, underneath, there are a couple oil pan bolts. I'm going to get those in a second, but I just want to finish everything from up front here. So I'll move on to this one, 15 millimeter. More 13s. A nut over here, 13 millimeter, which holds the bracket for this AC component, and then behind that hides an 18 millimeter stud. All right, so I figured this out. I'm going to pry the bracket for the transmission lines off of the stud, and with it pried off, that'll expose a 22 millimeter stud just like on the other side. Okay. All right, and it looks like the last thing is to get out the oil pan bolts from underneath, so let's do that. Here you go. From underneath you can see the four 13 millimeter bolts that we have to remove. All right, let's go back up top and take that timing cover off. We have to take out a 10 millimeter bolt here that bolts this timing cover onto the power steering pump. There we go. There it is. Right next to the AC compressor, you have your crank position sensor, and that needs to get unplugged because it's bolted to the timing cover, of course. Hey, I got it. As you can see, timing cover is loose, so we'll just slowly walk it off of here. Be very, very gentle if you're using pry bars. Okay. All right. There you have it. There's your timing cover. Take that off, set it aside. I want to remove the sensor ring for the crankshaft position sensor. Get that out of there so we can have direct access to the chains. And at this point, I will reinstall my crankshaft bolt so that we can actually rotate this engine and time it properly. So I'll put this on. You don't have to tighten it, just run it down all the way. It'll basically tighten itself once we turn the engine over, and then you'll need an air gun to remove it. Okay, that's tight. As you can see, it started moving the engine, so I'm going to stop right there. Let me show you the proper timing marks. Since we're on the crankshaft, I'm going to show you this. The crankshaft, this keyway here, needs to be at the 12 o'clock position, straight up and down. And then I went ahead and marked the cams for you so that you can see it better. This is just a little indent. The sprocket is notched out. I marked it with a yellow crayon so that you can actually see it. So this is one of them right here on the passenger side cam, and this one needs to be positioned at the 11 o'clock position. So right about here, not straight up and down, a little bit to the left, 11 o'clock. And then the driver's side one over here has the same mark. I also marked it with a yellow crayon so you can see it better. This one, however, has to be straight up and down at the 12 o'clock position. So let's rotate the crank and line everything up. So what you're looking for here is 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 12 o'clock. Pretty simple. In order for me to not fight compression, I'm actually going to remove all 8 spark plugs and get them out of the way. Otherwise, I'm going to be fighting the compression of every single cylinder as I turn this engine over. This also allows me to inspect them. This engine is known for having spark plugs blow out of it, so this is a perfect time to check it. That one was loose. That one was not super tight, but I guess bottomed out. Loose. This one was like, you know, just ready to come right out. Probably hanging on by a couple threads. Yeah. All right, now it's time to turn the engine over and line up the timing marks. No compression in our way, which is gonna be a lot easier. Oh yeah. So I have a broken timing chain guide here, so I'm gonna actually hold it down manually. That way the chain can actually sit where it needs to sit. All right, so I'm at 12 o'clock there, 11 right here. The only problem is I'm not at 12 down there, so I'm gonna have to go around one more time and line it all up. I got all my marks lined up. Let's take out the passenger side timing chain tensioner, which is this one over here. I'm gonna loosen up the 2 bolts for it. They are 10mm bolts. Use a 3/8 Allen, stick it in with a breaker bar, move the cam around to release the timing chain off of the cam, let go of it. Because I have my quick release timing chain guide here, I'm joking, you know, it's broken. So typically you'd want to unbolt it. Mine just fell right off. We're going to take these bolts out in a minute, but now you can take the timing chain off. Do not rotate it. Don't rotate the crank at this point. Don't rotate this side. It's not timed anymore, and you will cause damage if you start rotating things. Let's do the same thing to the driver's side. I'm actually going to hold the cam with my 3/8 breaker bar here and undo these bolts. Take these out, take out the tensioner. Get this out of here. Slowly let go of this. You can take out this timing chain guide. since I forgot, might as well do this now. Take off the passenger side timing chain guide. And to finish it off, let's unbolt this timing chain guide over here with an 8mm socket. Might as well break these two free. The one from the passenger side with the broken guide. Okay, let's get all these out. So it's time to put the timing chain on. So when you get your new timing chain, you'll notice that it has two links at the top that are colored. These are gold. I've seen them blue. They can be any other color, but they are a different color than the regular chain. And then there's one on the other end that is also colored. So two at the top, one at the bottom. If you stretch it out and hold it flat, this bottom one should sit perpendicular to the other ones. And then these top ones sit parallel to each other, just like this. And these two have to line up with the mark on the camshaft, and then the bottom one needs to line up with a dot on the crank sprocket. I have another sprocket here. I'm not installing it. This is from another timing chain kit, but the sprocket has this dot here, and that is what the chain needs to line up with. And the reason I'm showing you now is because the dot is underneath. You can't see it from up top. You'll need a mirror. So this is what it needs to look like. You have this dot lining up with this one colored link here, and that's how you know you install the chain properly on the crank. This applies to both the inner and the outer chain. So this is what you're looking for on the bottom, and on the top, the chain needs to line up just like that. You have this line lining up in the middle of these two colored links. So that's all you need to know to properly time this engine. If you line up these two marks on one chain and then these two marks on the other chain, it is timed. That's it. That's all you need to know. So let's put this on. Obviously, I have to start with the driver's side head because this one sits further in, and then on top of that goes the passenger side. So let's start here. I'm going to put on the guides. I cleaned up all my hardware. On the driver's side chain, you have two different bolts for this lower guide. The long one goes into this hole that doesn't have the flat ear coming out like this one. This one takes the smaller bolt, and that is because this longer one here actually goes through your oil pump and then bolts on. So it goes down just like this. This top mounting bolt, the shim for it has a little bit of play to it, so you can adjust it up and down depending on how you need it to line up. Now I'm going to take my ratchet and snug these up by hand, and then we'll go ahead and torque them. These bolts get torqued to 89 inch-pounds, which converts to about 7.5 foot-pounds. If you don't have a torque wrench that goes that low, just make them nice and snug with a small ratchet. Perfect. I coated this guide in a slight coating of oil, very thin layer, so that it doesn't run dry for the first 5-10 seconds, however long it takes for the chain to get fully lubricated since we have a brand new chain. I did the same thing to this tensioner guide. So now, to install this one, you'll notice that one has a little hump here, the other one does not. The one with the hump is for the driver's side chain. So slide this on here just like so, and we can just let it float for now. Now I want to put in my tensioner, and because I have a new tensioner, it has this little locking tab on it, which will make it stay compressed until I'm ready to apply tension and pull the tab. So we can actually install it now without worrying that it's going to mess up the timing or make it difficult to install the chain or anything like that because it's completely compressed. So, has a new gasket on here, of course. That's going to seal up nice. The surface is nice and clean. Take your bolts out of the old tensioner, slide them in here. I'll go ahead and start them in. And you'll see, actually I should mention this, you'll see that they're marked. It's kind of hard to see on this one because the tab is in the way, but this one says L for left. All right, so let's run these down and then torque them. These two bolts get tightened down to 18 foot-pounds. Now take one of your chains, does not matter which one. I'm going to position it on the sprocket down here, on the inner part of the sprocket, And now, before I go further, I'm going to go grab a mirror and make sure that it's properly positioned. I want it lined up with that dot that I showed you. Oh, one tooth off. Okay, there we go. I am perfectly lined up with it now. You can see there's the dot and there is the chain. Kind of hard to see on camera, but you know, it's lined up. So now, don't let go of it because it's going to skip. And because this side is the tensioner side, it's going to have slack on it, and on the bottom, we'll have to put tension on it. And at the top here, like I said, make sure you line up the sprocket with the proper links, just like this. And let's see, we're probably going to be a couple teeth off. Yep, that's fine. We're actually not too far off. I'm going to stick my 3/8 drive extension in there so I can turn the cam. Oh, one more tooth. Okay, right there. Put the chain on. There it is. I'm going to take this guide back off, slide it on the chain, make sure it's positioned properly, and just go ahead and push everything back into place. Make sure this sprocket is in all the way. The guide is sitting where it needs to be. Give this a couple back and forth movements to make sure the chain is fully seated. Oh, see, there we go. It's important to check it. Looks like we have some slack here, so I want to check the tooth on the bottom because there's too much tension here, too much slack here. I don't like it, and I think it jumped a tooth. Okay, well, it didn't. So what that means is once tension is being applied here, it's going to turn this cam counterclockwise, which, looking at it right now, it's supposed to be at the 12 o'clock position. It's kind of like towards the 12:30, closer to the 1 o'clock position. So that makes sense as to why it has slack on the bottom, because naturally the springs want to push it that way, but it needs to come back like this. And then you can see we have tension here and slack here. So that's actually perfect. I'm not going to touch this anymore. Take your 3/8 extension out of there. And this chain is on. The tensioner is ready to be engaged, but we're first going to put the other side on before we pull this. Now let's install this upper guide. This is the one that was broken for us. Run it down and then torque the bolts to 89 inch-pounds. Now I'm going to put the guide that goes on the tensioner, but I won't put this tensioner in yet. I think on the other side I should have waited to put the tensioner in. I had a harder time putting the chain on than I would have if I didn't have the tensioner. So I'm going to leave it like this, put the chain on, and then put the tensioner in. Hopefully that makes a difference. And now let's get the chain on. I'm going to start by guessing the position, and then I'll take my mirror and double check it. Okay, so it's one tooth off. It needs to go counterclockwise. Nope, clockwise. There it is, perfect. Lines up exactly on the dot. I'm not going to show you, you already saw the other side. Okay, so now on this one, the top needs to have tension on it. The bottom is the slack side because that's where the tensioner goes. So this has tension. Obviously we're very far off here. You can see several chain links. Stick your 3/8 ratchet in there. Hold the chain. Spin this, and okay, I gotta go one more tooth. That is it right there. Okay, perfect. We're on. I'm gonna let go, but be very careful when you do this because you don't want it to jump timing. So hold it like this. Don't push the chain down because it'll slack off. This will fly, jump timing, and fly backwards. So now last thing to do is to put on the tensioner over here. I have it ready with bolts. Pull the chain up, pull the guide up. Everything is lubricated with oil. Make sure the tensioner slides underneath this guide here, just like that. Perfect. This bolt started in. This one just started in as well. We'll bottom these out, torque them to 18 foot-pounds, and the chain is on. The engine is timed. So then we can pull the pin, rotate it several turns to make sure all is well. I'm gonna use my air ratchet to drive it in just so it can go a little faster. I'm not tightening them with this. Now with the chains on, everything is lined up. I double checked all of my marks. This is lined up, this is lined up, crank is lined up on both chains. It's time to pull the tabs on the tensioners. I'm going to start with this one. Doesn't matter which one you start with, they should come right out. And now tension is applied to the chain. Now at this point, optional but highly recommended, let's spin the engine over by hand and make sure that timing marks still line up after several rotations. As you remember, I have my spark plugs out, so it'll be a lot easier to spin. Oops. Oh. Now. Okay. Well, it's going to take a while for the timing marks to actually fully line up again, but if we just time it back to top dead center, we should know whether we have it properly timed or not. So bring that cam at 11 o'clock. This one's pretty much at 12. The crank, this pin here, it's not going to be at 12 o'clock, but the divot on the bottom, which I can feel right here, should be at 6 o'clock facing straight down, which it is. So you can spin it as many times as you want at this point. It should be all set. Here's our timing cover. It's nice and clean. Well, as clean as it's going to get. This is stained. You're never going to get it looking brand new. These gaskets along the side have already come off for me. They peeled off when I took the timing cover off. This one is stuck, and I have a new one. You don't want to reuse this one. I strongly suggest putting on a new one. So what I'm going to do to get this thing off is take a pick, or you can take a screwdriver, whatever you have, to get this thing started. And once you get it started coming off of here, just peel it off the rest of the way. And make sure the surface is clean, which it is. There's no debris in here actually, so there's nothing for me to clean. If there is, just take a screwdriver or a pick again and just scrape it all off. As you can see, there's some gasket maker left over here. That's because this is where the block and the head meet. We'll have to reapply some when the time comes to reinstall this cover, but for now I just want to get this off of here so that the new gasket maker can have a clean surface to seal up against. And of course you want to do the same everywhere where there is gasket maker, which leads me into this surface here. You can see there's more gasket maker here, and this is for where the valve cover bolts on. So take whatever you have and clean this off. And I'm just going to go around and clean off the whole rest of this surface. The reason I'm doing this now, not before I ran this through the parts washer, is because this was so full of gunk and debris. I needed it to be clean so I could see what I'm cleaning, if that makes any sense. Do the same thing on the bottom where this bolts up to the oil pan. You want this surface nice and clean because we'll have to put some gasket maker on the corners of this too. I strongly recommend a new front main seal or crank seal, whatever you want to call it. You're here, you might as well. So to remove this one, I'm using a seal puller, but you can use a screwdriver, a pry bar. Basically, you just have to pop it out. You can even punch it down and through. Whatever you have to do to get it out of here. As long as you don't damage the surface where it mounts, it doesn't really matter how you remove it. Well, obviously for me that's not working. It's not even moving, so I'm going to take a punch and just punch it through downward, and then we'll figure out the installation once this is out. There we go. Make sure you don't damage the surface while you're doing this. There it is. It's nice and clean here, except for at the top it has a lip of debris and buildup. So I'm going to take a piece of very fine sandpaper or emery cloth and just clean the ridge up so that when I install the seal, it doesn't cause any damage. Of course, I will use a clean rag with some brake parts cleaner on it and degrease the surface. A little bit of brake parts cleaner on a clean rag, and look at all the junk we got off of there. Definitely make sure that the surface is nice and clean. Go underneath as well. I think we're ready to install the new crank seal. Now, when you install this seal, you want to press on the outer lip here where it has a metal sleeve going around. You don't want to press on the inside or on this lip here or even in here, because it will damage the seal. And even when you do press on the outer lip, you don't just press on one side, because you'll end up with something like this where it's all deformed and damaged. You need a cup, preferably. I have this out of my ball joint press and I cleaned it all up, and it actually fits perfectly around this seal. It is the exact same diameter as the seal, which is what I'm looking for. And with this, I'm able to press this down and in perfectly flat and evenly around, and it will get a nice tight seal in there. With your seal nice and flat, go ahead and tap it in. Perfect. At this point, you want to feel around, make sure that it's perfectly even everywhere, which it is. For me, it has seated perfectly. Now at this point, you want to be careful not to hit the seal or damage it in any way, because it's new and it's ready to be installed, and you don't want to have to buy another one and do the job all over again. So at this point, let's put the gaskets on. This is not the right one. You'll know if you have the wrong one because it only fits one way. That must be the other side. Oh, there we go. I just found the right side. So it might take a couple tries to actually find the correct side, but once you do, it will literally fall into place. All you have to do is press it down to secure it, and just do this for all the other ones. I'll put on this one next. No sealant is required on this gasket here. Don't worry about putting anything on it. This gets installed dry, and put this one on. So at this point, the timing cover is ready to be installed, so let's do that. Now we have to put some gasket maker on a few different areas, 6 areas in total to be precise. 2 areas on each head, so right here where the head meets the block, just put a little dab of gasket maker on here so that the timing cover can seal up properly. You don't need a lot, this is plenty like this. Do the same to the other side, of course, and then do the same underneath where the head meets the block. Right over here, this one's a little harder to see. Try not to put too much on, just a little bit. And of course, do the same to the other side. Then we need to do something similar in the corner of the oil pan where it meets the block. You can see there's already some. I'm just gonna add a little more. Not the best way to do it. Ideally, you'd want to replace that gasket, but this should hold up for us. That's about all you need. Don't go overboard because, well, there's no need to. It's just going to spill into the timing area, so that's not great. It's not what you want. Make sure I level it out with my finger. One last thing before the cover goes on is this toner ring for the crank sensor. Go ahead and put this on. Obviously, we have to take the bolt out first. The little teeth should be facing you. You can see they have a direction, but if you're not sure, it says front on it, and that is the front of the engine. That's what that means. And it can only go in one way because it has this slot for the little key in there. And there you have it. That's all you need. Let's put the timing cover on, bring it down. Make sure no wires are getting pinched. Slide it over. It has 2 dowel pins that it'll line up with. Just go ahead and press it on. Let's put some bolts in. I'm going to start down here. Thread them all on by hand to make sure it lines up. I want to push the cover on with those center bolts. That's why I'm also starting these that go around the water pump. Also, I should have mentioned, but before you put this on, obviously, when you clean and change the gasket on the cover, also clean the surface on the engine so that everything can be nice and clean and seals up properly. So let's run these down and press the cover up against the engine block. Actually, I'm gonna start a few more bolts because might as well. And let's start all of these studs as well. Remember, these all the way at the top had this ground connector on them. Obviously I'm gonna have to take this off, so I'll just do it now. That way we can access the head of the stud. This one also had it, I just took it off. And this one also had this extra nut. That was for this AC line here. So the only bolts that we're missing right now are the one that goes through the power steering pump and then the 4 oil pan bolts that go up into the timing cover. So let's snug these up and then we'll move to those. I'm going very slow with my air gun. Okay, let's get those 2 large ones on the bottom. I just want to snug them for now. I will torque them after they're all snugged up. But this is going to pull the timing chain cover evenly onto the block. That's exactly what I want. That's snug. That's snug. Let me re-snug these, and then I actually want to put the oil pan bolts in so that those holes are all lined up. Run these in as well. And these. So there is a sequence for torquing the timing cover here. You start on this bolt, then you go to this one over here, then this one, then this one, then this one. And these are the 13mm headed narrower thread bolts. So you start with the smallest one, torque those to 18 foot-pounds. Then you're supposed to torque those 2 22mm studs on the bottom to 35 foot-pounds. And then you go to 35 foot-pounds in this particular sequence. You go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And now we'll switch to an 18mm socket. And now if you wanted to double check them, go ahead, but they're most likely gonna all be perfectly fine. So now let's put this bolt in and then the 4 on the bottom through the oil pan. That goes in from the side here through the power steering pump. All right, it's getting close here. It's bottomed out and nice and snug. All right, let's put the lower oil pan bolts in. There are 4 of them, 13mm headed bolts. Slide them in, thread them on by hand. You don't want these cross-threading, of course. And the torque for these is in a specific sequence also. 1, 2, so the furthest ones first, and then 3 and 4, which are the middle ones. And those you torque to 15 foot-pounds at first, and then an additional 60 degrees. $15 foot-pounds. And now 60 degrees. On this lower stud here on the timing cover, let's put on a bracket for this line. This is the transmission line. Slide that on all the way, and we'll have to obviously connect the crank sensor. After that, don't forget about it. Let's put this nut on. This was a 15mm nut. Go ahead and snug it up. Plug in the crank position sensor. You're gonna have to push it up hard so it clicks, just like that. Give it a quick tug to ensure, because if this is not plugged in, or it's not making a good connection, your truck won't start. I have cleaned and lubricated the backside of the harmonic balancer where it bolts on to the crankshaft, or not bolts on, but slides on. As you can see, I cleaned this area here. I lubricated it with a thin coat of engine oil so that the seal can slide easily over it as I press it on. I also did that on the inside here so it doesn't get hung up on the crank, it goes on nice and smoothly. Use engine oil, not anything else. Now take it, line it up with the keyway on the crank. If you don't line it up, it's not going to slide on. So give it a couple twists until you know that it's lined up, and there we go. At this point, it should slide on. Now you're going to put your installer tool on here, tighten it up, and we're going to go ahead and drive this harmonic balancer all the way in. Okay, that's bottomed out. Let's release pressure from here. Remove the tool. Remove the rest of the tool. Go ahead and put a little bit of gasket maker on the washer of the bolt, of the crank bolt, and then a little bit in between the washer and the head of the bolt, just enough to create a nice tight seal. Stick the bolt in, and then there is a torque spec, but that torque spec is meant for a brand new bolt. I'm going to give you that, but if you're reusing your original bolt, just do your best and make it nice and tight. Kind of like that. So the full torque spec for a brand new bolt is to tighten it to 66 foot-pounds, loosen the bolt completely, don't take it out, just loosen it, then tighten it to 37 foot-pounds, then an additional 90 degrees. Again, this is if you're using a brand new bolt. Now to install the power steering pump pulley, you'll need a power steering pump pulley installer. Looks like this. It's got one of these threaded rods. To thread it in a little bit more, I'm just going to use the help of my air ratchet. Hold the shaft over here and just make sure it's bottomed out all the way. Don't have to go crazy tight on it. Slide the pulley over, put the tool back together, and I'm going to hold the stud and tighten up this nut, which has a bearing in it, and it'll help rotate. And this, as you tighten it, will push the pulley back onto the pump. Be careful how far you push it though, because if you push it too far, you're going to have to pull it back out with the removal tool. We'll just take it slow and check every once in a while. So once you get it close, let's remove the tool and then we'll see how far this actually has gone in, if it needs to go more or if it's too far. And there you have it. The pulley is flush with the end of the shaft that's coming out of the pump. That's perfect. If when you put your belt on, you notice that it's squealing and it wasn't before, it's probably because this pulley isn't lined up perfectly. So just try to figure out if it's too far out or too far in and just adjust accordingly. The pump does have a little bit of play in the shaft here, and that usually helps with lining itself up. But for some reason, if you put it on too far or not enough, well, like I said, it'll squeal and then you'll have to adjust it. Now with the valve covers cleaned up, let's install some new gaskets so we can put the valve covers on. I'm only going to show you one side. I actually already did the other side, and the gaskets, which I recommend, you'll see that on one side the groove has a kind of like a split down the middle. That is the side that faces the head. The side that does not have a groove, it just has one pointy area, it goes on the valve cover. And they can only go on one way, as in you can only put the left gasket on the left valve cover and the right one on the right one. And the other sign to look for when you install them to line them up properly is these two areas. These are to be lined up with the head and the timing cover. So basically here and here. Once you have all those reference points, it's easy for it to fall right into place. And then I'll show you how to put the bolts in, because if yours have fallen out, which most likely they will, if you take the gasket off, it's not difficult, but it is an annoying process to put the bolts back in. And before we proceed, I have this very poorly drawn diagram that shows where the studded bolts go and where the non-studded bolts go. So this is going to be the passenger side, which is this one here that I've already assembled. You can see has a studded bolt here, so on the front side of the engine, then one right next to the oil filler neck, and then it skips one, and then it goes to two more studded bolts. Basically, we're going to replicate the same exact thing on the driver's side. It's a mirror image of each other. So stud, 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 skip, stud, stud. So all the bolts are going to be the same. I'm only going to show you how to put in one. Once you put this one in, this is going to be the front corner, so it's going to be a studded bolt. I'm going to grab a pick, keep applying pressure on the bolt upwards so it wants to go through the mounting hole, and then take the pick and kind of put the gasket underneath the bolt. It has a lip here. It has a lip right here that the gasket has to slide under, and only then will it be fully installed. There we go. Twist it around, and now your bolt will stay in place. Just go around and do the same to all the other ones. Now to install the valve covers, let's put a little bit of gasket maker right here where the timing cover meets the head, on both ends of course, not a lot, just a dab. And with the surface still clean, take the valve cover and slide it right over. I'm going to try and start in a couple of these bolts so that it stays in place, stays secure, and then we'll thread them on and actually run them down. I'm going to come back and torque them, but for now I'm just going to snug them up, starting from the center, working my way out. The torque for these is 89 inch-pounds in the same sequence, starting from the center, working your way out. Now it's time to put the passenger side valve cover on, and I'm going to do the same thing. Put gasket maker on those areas where the timing cover meets the head. Here, that's probably a little too much, I'll wipe some off. And down here, you can't see it, but trust me, I'm putting it on. Now the trick to this one is to come in at an angle and then bring it up and over this rear cam lobe over there, obviously underneath all this wiring. At the same time, make sure that the gasket doesn't pop off. Just like this, and then twist it, and it should fall right into place. Of course, I'm going to double check before I bolt it down tight to make sure that that gasket behind or in the back there is still properly secured. I don't want it pinching and leaking later down the line. Okay, I'm looking at it from underneath inside the wheel well. It looks great. Everything lines up as it should. So I'm going to start all of these bolts down here. That way they're threaded on properly. Then I'll just grab my air ratchet, run them down, and of course we will torque them. Okay, I'm going to start in the center and work my way out. Okay, now let's torque them to 89 inch-pounds. I'm going to start in the center, work my way towards the outside. All right, valve cover's tight. At this point, it would be easiest to install the spark plugs now because the intake is still out of the way. I strongly suggest new spark plugs, but if yours are still good, I guess go ahead and reuse them. The torque for these is 13 foot-pounds. Do not lubricate the threads with anything. They go in dry. Perfect. It's time to reinstall the intake. When you do this, make sure you put new gaskets on. I did. So this is ready to go. The surface is clean. Let's bring the intake in and slide it down onto the head here. Make sure you don't pinch any wires. I'm going to go back there and double check. Make sure your fuel lines are accessible and not jammed between the firewall and the intake. All right, let's make sure everything's lined up. It is. Let's put the bolts in. Don't forget to put this on and then drop the bolts through. Make sure that these line up. I'm going to start all of them by hand before I go any further. That way I make sure that the threads are good. So now let's put the rest of them back. Now I'm going to bottom out all the bolts starting from the center, working my way out. And the torque spec for this has 2 passes in that sequence, one at 18 inch-pounds and the other one at 18 foot-pounds. 18 inch-pounds is basically just bottomed out. So if I just bottom it out, there's the first pass. Okay, now let's torque them all. 18 foot-pounds. Intake is torqued down. Let's get the throttle body on. Bring in the throttle body and we'll install this. Okay. Make sure the gasket's still seated in place there. And then try to line up the bolts. I think this one, yeah, that one lines up. I'm gonna start this one in and finally one at the back. Pretty difficult to see all these, but just feel for them. I'm gonna go ahead and bottom these out and then we'll snug them up. All right, so with the throttle body on, I have a slight situation here with the vacuum hoses because I actually bought a new PCV hose system assembly here. So it also came with this hose, which is the coolant hose that leads to this valve on the throttle body. And then from there, it leads through this to the intake. Well, this is staying, but this rear hose has to go, as well as, I think, this one over here, which is to be replaced with this, which is on the new assembly. So basically, you may not have to do this step, but I do. So I'm just gonna quickly swap over some hoses. And once it's rerouted, because you probably don't have to do this, I'm not gonna show you in detail, but I will show you exactly how it needs to be routed once it's all done. So here's what it's supposed to look like once it's done. Right out of the PCV from the valve cover, make sure that's pressed in all the way. So from down here, this main long tube, plastic tube, goes all the way to the back of the intake. It's got a large rubber 90-degree fitting on there. Make sure that's plugged in. It tees off of this into a smaller little tube, plastic tube that feeds the throttle body. This is your PCV. This assembly is a heated PCV with coolant, so it has 2 coolant hoses that go into here. You can see one comes off of the water pump tube off the back, comes into the PCV on the valve cover, goes back out into the throttle body over here, right where the vacuum hose goes in. Then it comes out through this hose, which will plug into the intake. And one of the only other hoses here is a coolant hose. This main heater core hose that also plugs into the intake. So let's get those in, but this is kind of what this is all supposed to look like. It's a mess, not easy to figure out, especially if you were in my situation where someone kind of rigged everything and hacked it together and I had to figure out what piece goes where, but this is what it's supposed to look like. So let's get this main heater core hose plugged in, get the clamp back on, and then get the smaller hose from the throttle body back on as well. This one just had a hose clamp. Go ahead and tighten that back up. Make sure it's pressed down all the way. Nice and snug. Now it's time to reconnect the fuel lines, and to do that, it's much easier than removing them. All you have to do is line them up and press them on until they click and snap into place. It's kind of hard to show you when I'm actually doing it because there's very limited space, but this is what it should look like when you're done. You're supposed to see the spring around it seat right into place, and if you don't see it, that means it has not snapped around the retaining ring on the fuel rail, and it will pop off eventually. So make sure that you can see that spring looking retainer around it. Double check it, even triple check it if you have to, and obviously we'll check for fuel leaks when we're done. But for now, just make sure that the feed and the return lines are pressed onto the fuel rail tightly. Let's reconnect all of our fuel injectors, and then we'll drop the ignition coils in, bolt those up, and plug those in as well. When you plug in the fuel injectors, make sure it has a good connection. I'm gonna blow out the holes that the spark plugs sit in. That way when I drop the ignition coils in, there's no debris that gets stuck in there, just in case any fell. I prefer to put all my ignition coils back in the same order that they came out in. It's not necessary, it's just what I prefer to do. And another tip is to put some silicone paste or dielectric grease on the end of the ignition coils. This will just help them to not only seal up better moisture-wise, but also to prevent them from getting stuck on the spark plugs when the next time comes that you have to pull them out. I'm just going to drop all of them in and then I'll bolt them up. While I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and plug them all in. These just have some screws that hold them on, so start them into the intake and just go ahead and snug them up. That's snug. Just do the same thing down the line, and of course we'll do the same thing to the other side once this side's done. So I did the same on this side. I plugged in all of the injectors, ignition coils, bolted them on. Everything is all set. Let's situate all these vacuum hoses wherever they have to go. So this hose goes onto the intake tube. We'll leave this aside for now. Same with this one over here. These two connectors will go on a little valve that goes here in a minute. We're going to ignore that. This goes on the top of the throttle body over there. There are two hoses at the back of the throttle body. One goes to this evap solenoid here, which connects onto the top of the two rear fittings. And then your brake booster line will connect onto the bottom of the two rear fittings. Press that on all the way, make sure that it's secure, otherwise you lose power brakes if that pops off. Then you have this line right over here, which is supposed to connect to your, it's a red vacuum hose. It connects to your fuel pressure regulator down here. And you also have this tan off-white vacuum hose, which connects to this evap control unit here, which is also where this line comes from, the vacuum hose that connects to the top of the rear of the throttle body. And while we're here, let's plug in the throttle body, or the throttle position sensor, that is. That goes over here, just like that. On these studs here, I had these ground connectors, which plug into this harness over here. Plug that in, secure it, finish bolting up that nut. So I'll just make sure this is all clean, put it on, and tighten up this nut. And of course, we'll do the same to the other side. I'm gonna put back the two bolts that hold that big bracket, which happens to hold the power steering pump reservoir. The bracket is slotted, so if I start the bolts in, I can slide the bracket over them. Make sure this is nice and snug. And since we're here, let's put the oil dipstick tube back, bolt it up. Perfect. Now let's resecure the dipstick tube for the transmission. Start in the bolt, and we'll bottom it out, snug it up. Use your 8mm socket. It doesn't have to be very tight, just make sure it doesn't move around. Perfect. I'm going to remove these 2 bolts that I left here on the throttle body just so I don't lose them. And I'm going to go ahead and bolt the EGR back up. Now, of course, you should use a gasket here, preferably a new gasket. If you don't have one, you can try and see if you can save and reuse your old one, but most likely it's not going to work. So put on a new gasket, slide this on, and bolt it up. Let's tighten this up. Make sure it's nice and snug so it can seal up. You don't want any leaks here. And at the top here, you see this vacuum hose, the green one, that actually plugs in to the EGR valve. Just like that. Now let's go ahead and thread on the lower fitting of this EGR onto the manifold. Let's get it close to being bottomed out. Slide your wrench on it. And make sure that it is nice and tight. Next, I want to get this power steering reservoir bolted back up to this bracket so we can continue with putting back brackets on this side. So put back all the bolts that you removed. There should be 3 8mm headed bolts. We'll snug these up and then move to these here, which actually hold on the bracket for everything that gets bolted up here. And over here went this triangulated bracket, which bolts onto the power steering pump reservoir bracket, and then on the other side, it bolts up to the upper radiator hose neck. Now let's put in this bracket, which has the EGR pressure sensor on it, and then this solenoid here. This went right in here behind all these vacuum hoses. This hook, this loop here, went over this first bolt on the EGR valve. So you'll have to slide that over. And then it has a nut that clamps it on. Okay, just like that. Make sure you're not pinching any vacuum lines here, but also don't pull on them too hard because they do break. Plug this in so this connector stops flopping around. I'm going to plug these 2 hoses in so that this can be situated. So let's put on the nut that holds it on back there. While I'm here, I'm just going to go ahead and plug in these 2 hoses. One is smaller, one is larger, as you can see. Go ahead and plug them in their corresponding fitting. Okay, so this nut is on. There's a screw here that secures this bracket to the intake. I'm going to start by tightening this one. And now let's tighten up this one in the back here. Okay, that's secured. Let's plug this in here. Plug in the sensor. Now let's reconnect this bracket for the throttle cables. Had 3 screws that mounted it to the intake. And reconnect the throttle cables, attach the spring, attach this cable, and of course we will attach this one as well. All right, test it. Yep, perfect. No slack. Make sure the throttle body closes all the way. If it doesn't, most likely your cable is not adjusted properly, but if it was before you took the bracket off, it's probably because the bracket isn't sitting far enough in. So just make sure that that is happening. It looks like I do have a little bit of movement. So what I'm going to do is loosen up the nuts on the bracket just a little bit so I can adjust it. If you don't do this right, you'll have a high idle, and well, it's just not going to be fun. Of course, you could adjust the cable, but you know, it was already adjusted, so might as well adjust it from the bracket. Okay, that's better actually. So we'll tighten this up. All right, now I want to put the alternator back. Had a couple bolts up here. One that just fell in the valley here, but here it is. And then 2 main bolts on the bottom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tighten up these bottom bolts first. That will make sure that the alternator is positioned properly, and then I'll tighten up the 2 top bracket bolts. Make sure they're nice and snug. Now bring the wiring harness over and let's plug it in. The one thing you want to check though is this main power wire. If it has any corrosion on it, go ahead and sand it with some fine sandpaper or a wire brush or whatever you have, just to get the corrosion off of there. Mine's actually perfect, so I'm just going to go ahead and install it. I'm going to route it behind these coolant hoses because I'm pretty sure that's how it was before. I'm going to tighten this one by hand because I don't want to accidentally over tighten it. If you over tighten this, you can break the stud inside the alternator, and that would not be good. So just give it a nice quick snug, and then plug in the other 2 wires, which I should have routed behind prior, but here we go. This is one. Make sure that clicks in. And then the other one goes in right here. Make sure this one clicks in as well. Now let's put back the serpentine belt tensioner and the idler. Get these 3 started. Let's bottom them out. Let's put on this one as well, and then we'll torque both of them at once. Make sure this pulley is seated all the way. 18 foot-pounds is the torque for all 3 of these bolts, as well as this 13mm one for the idler. Now I want to clean this area inside here before I put the new water pump on, and I'm going to go in with a wire wheel and very, very gently kind of scuff up the surface. I just want to remove some of this corrosion. It's pretty severe, although it could be worse, but it's pretty bad, and I don't think that this will seal up perfectly in this condition. So that's what I choose to do. If you want, you can do it by hand with some sandpaper, or if it's clean enough, you just don't even have to do anything. But you do want to clean it up if it is corroded. Now take the new water pump, make sure the gasket is seated on here, this O-ring, and it's going to seal up nicely. As you can see from the bolt pattern, it can only go on one way, with the 2 closer bolts up here and then the 2 wider ones for the ones that are further apart at the bottom here. And this freeze plug sits down towards the bottom. If you wanted to, you could put a little bit of coolant on that O-ring to lubricate it, or whatever else you prefer. Make sure that when you slide it in, the O-ring doesn't roll over and pop out of its groove. You're gonna have to wiggle it back and forth a little bit. You do want to seat it by hand. You don't want to just suck it in with the mounting bolts, because sometimes when you pull it in with the mounting bolts, it can actually rip that O-ring and you won't even know it until it doesn't seal anymore. So now let's start these bolts in by hand. We'll snug them up and torque them down. Oops, it popped out. So I guess I'll have to do that again, but at least if these are started, it'll slide in straight. All right, let's bottom these out. Going in a cross pattern just so I can fully seat this water pump. And now we can torque them. The torque for this is 18 foot-pounds, and I'm going to do the same thing, go in a cross pattern to make sure that it is fully seated. I'm going to slide in my fan pulley, the water pump pulley, I guess. Line up the bolt holes. Let's bottom these out. The torque is also 18 foot-pounds for these. I'm also going to go in a cross pattern for this one. To torque this, I'm going to use a little pry bar just to try to hold this pulley from spinning. Perfect. Let's put the upper radiator hose in. Make sure it's fully seated on this fitting. Get the clamp and put it right back where it belongs. If your clamp is weak, consider replacing it with either another one of these or a warm clamp, whatever works for you. It's time to put the serpentine belt back, and to do that, I'm going to show you a diagram on the screen. That way it's going to be a lot easier for you to figure out how it goes, other than just looking at the video. But basically I'm going to start around the crankshaft here, around the harmonic balancer. From here, I mean, the sequence doesn't really matter, it's just a matter of preference. I'm just going to go around clockwise, follow the belt clockwise, making sure that it is on the right pulleys, on the splines and everything. So from here I'm going to go up and around the water pump, then down and underneath the power steering. Then from the power steering it goes all the way up over the alternator, and then you have to squeeze it through. Oh, here we go. This is what happens when you have a new belt. And then from here you actually have to squeeze it in between the tensioner and the idler so it can reach down to the AC, kind of like this, and then you fish it down here. I'm trying to hold tension on it at the same time. All right, so this is it right here. You just have to put a 1/2 inch breaker bar in the tensioner, release tension, and then slip it onto the AC compressor. Or actually, if I take it off the alternator here, I might be able to get this on the AC easier, and then I'll have an easier time putting it on the alternator as opposed to the AC compressor all the way down there. And popped off again. So let's get this breaker bar, push down on this to release tension, slide it up on here, and remove the breaker. Well, don't remove the breaker bar yet. What you want to do is, with it still on, make sure that the belt is positioned properly on all of the pulleys. The ribbed ones, make sure that it's sitting in all the ribs, otherwise the grooves will cut through the belt as it's riding on sideways, crooked. Everything seems perfect, so now you can remove the breaker bar. And when we first start the vehicle, I'm gonna shut it off after a few seconds and double check the belt to make sure that it is properly routed, because like I said, if it's not 100% seated, it will jump off and create all sorts of damage. So now when it comes time to putting on the fan, you have to put it in together with the fan shroud. So drop these two in. Watch out for your radiator fins. You don't want to damage anything. Try to position the fan shroud so that it's as lined up as it can be with the radiator, with its mounting points. At this point, I'm going to try to thread on this fan onto the water pump so that it actually holds itself on, because it is heavy to hold at this angle. Okay, there we go. Getting it to catch onto the first thread is always the most difficult part, but once it does, you can just spin it and it should easily go on. And now it's bottomed out and we need to tighten it up, for which we can use our special fan clutch tool. Set up the tool and tighten it up. The water pump started spinning, so I know it's tight. On the side here, make sure the fan shroud goes down into this hook on the radiator, on both sides that is. Mine did, perfect. Now you can put in the transmission lines, make sure that it snaps into place like that. Give it a tug to make sure it doesn't pop back out. Bring in the safety lock and lock it over like that. Now let's bolt up the fan shroud. Put in the two little 8mm headed bolts that held this on. There's one on each side. Let's get the upper radiator hose in, bottom it out, put the clamp back on. Now bring in this cover here at the front, line it up, and let's put in all the push clips that hold this on. And don't forget to put back the spare tire tool. And lastly, the air filter housing with the rest of the intake here. Slide that over the throttle body, just like this. You got two hoses that went in here. Let's tighten up this clamp. Make sure this is pushed on all the way when you tighten the clamp. Nice Nice and snug. These hoses are in. There's a wire here. Reconnect the sensor here. And on this side you have the mass airflow sensor. Reconnect that. Make sure it clicks. Secure the harness and secure the air filter housing. Now to reinstall the battery, make sure it's positioned all the way down on the battery post. It's important so it can make a good connection. And then use your 8mm wrench or socket, whatever you prefer, and tighten it back up. Now it's time to fill up the cooling system. What I have set up here is a spill-proof funnel, which also helps bleed the system. Because this is now the highest point in the cooling system, naturally the air will want to rise up into my funnel and not get trapped in the system. The only downside with doing this on this type of system is this overflow tank is also the filler, and it's not supposed to be full. If you fill this all the way up, you are way over full, and it's going to start spilling out once it warms up. So once you do fill this all the way up, if you choose to raise it up into the funnel, you want to make sure you drain some afterwards, either with a turkey baster or fluid extraction syringe, whatever you have, or just drain it out the radiator just a little bit. But there's a mark, which I'll show you in a second, and you don't want to be above that mark, otherwise you're overfull. So what I'm going to do here is just put in a little bit. Looks like this wasn't tight all the way. Make sure this is tight if you use this type of funnel, otherwise it'll leak out here as you do this. So now let's go ahead and put in the appropriate amount of coolant. It'll take about 2 gallons, maybe 2.5, depending on how much you drained. And if you don't know what kind of coolant to use, refer to your owner's manual and make sure you use the appropriate type. If you look closely, you can see right there, it says cold fill on the reservoir. That's exactly where you want to fill it up to. If you put a flashlight in either in the tank or to the side of it, you'll see the coolant line, the level, and just make sure you don't go past it unless you are actively trying to bleed it in your funnel here. So I actually filled mine right up to that fill mark. So now let me run you through the bleeding procedure. First, you want to wait for it to naturally stop bubbling. If it's still bubbling, just give it a minute. Wait for it to stop getting air out of the system. All right, now with the key in the ignition, let's fire it up. Starts right up. That's perfect. Now, once it's turned on, let's turn on some heat here. So turn on the blower. Make sure the AC is off. Turn the heat all the way up. I have this digital display. If you have the analog one with the knobs, just turn it all the way up. You want the coolant circulating through that heater core, and I'm gonna set it to vent. That way I can feel when the air blows warm over here. So I'm just gonna give it a minute and then wait for the air to blow over here. While it's warming up, pay attention to this temperature gauge and make sure it doesn't go above the halfway mark. Right now it's still cold, I just turned it on, but once it reaches full operating temperature, shut it off and obviously make sure you have heat through the vents. With everything back together, go ahead and run the vehicle and make sure everything is good, and then take it for a road test.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.